Hello and welcome to Jackson's Job. Today you will learn how to make a sweet short crust pastry, pâte sucrée, or a sweet pie dough and tart shell. The ingredients are very similar to the short crust pastry, but it is enriched with sugar, egg, and a splash of vanilla. This is the easiest pastry to bring together and is also the most delicate. We need to separate one large egg, that is about 50 grams out of the shell. We do not need the egg white for this recipe, so save it for your meringue in your pie or make an omelet. We don't want to use the egg white as it will make things puffed up and chewy. Think of that classic chocolate chip cookie. Next, in a large bowl, we will cream together our softened butter and sugar with an ordinary mixing spoon. We need a half a cup or 113 grams of softened butter. I have found pressing the butter onto the sides of the bowl first will help you mix that sugar in better when it comes to making it by hand. After we have briefly worked the butter, we're going to add in 1/4 cup or 50 grams of sugar. You want to beat these together until they're nice and smooth, but you don't want to beat it so much you are creating air. That's why I like to make it by hand as opposed to a mixer. But you can use a food processor or an electric mixer. If you do, use a very low speed. Just like the other pastry, you can also use lard, vegetable shortening, or a combination of these fats. If you use lard or shortening, you'll need to use a bit more water because the butter and margarine isn't 100% fat but has some liquid in their makeup. So you need to make up that water content when you are using lard or shortening. However, for this recipe, I really do recommend you use butter or margarine. Once we have that butter and sugar creamed together, we want to add in an egg yolk, which is 20 grams. You want to beat this until it's smooth and no longer curdled looking. Do not create a lot of air just like before, so if you're using that electric mixer, go on a low speed and just until it's combined. If you have noticed, unlike the other short crust pastry recipes, we're using the creamy method instead of that rub-in method where you have to start out with cold butter. This method is much easier to work with overall for the beginner. So I really like this recipe to teach people that have never done pie dough. Pâte Sucrée translates simply into sweet pie dough. This is a sweet short crust pastry that is rich, buttery, and also lightly sweetened to the taste. You'll really notice the sugar in comparison to the other recipes. You also make this using the creamy method to get a very solid, stable base. It will be quite sturdy and snappy underneath those cream pies and custard tarts. Pâte Sucrée is more dry and snaps in comparison to the pâte sablée, which is more sandy and crumbles. This crust is so delicate from the sugar that it practically melts in your mouth as you eat it. You will really enjoy this crust. Now that we have a nice smooth texture, we want to add in a bit of salt and vanilla for flavor. A little salt is all we need, only 1/8 of a teaspoon or 0.625 grams. The vanilla is optional, but I highly recommend it for this recipe. 1/2 of a teaspoon or 0.25 milliliters is plenty. Another option is to use the zest of a lemon instead. That really brightens up this pastry. Once those ingredients are nicely combined, we're going to add in 1½ cups of all-purpose or plain flour, that's 225 grams. And to that, we're going to add in some water, just 3 tablespoons or 45 milliliters. In addition to the water, we add in 1 teaspoon of white vinegar, 5 milliliters, or even lemon juice. The acidity in the vinegar or lemon juice will delay gluten formation and make the pastry more tender and easier to roll out. In this recipe, I actually prefer to use the lemon as it helps balance out some of that sweetness. However, if you don't have any lemon juice or vinegar on hand, you can omit it entirely and just replace that amount with water or leave it out. When it comes to short crust pastry, the flour should be twice the amount of fat by weight. Now, because I'm showing you volume measurements, it's off by a gram. That small amount isn't going to change the recipe noticeably. However, if you're using a scale, go ahead and make that 226 grams of flour to be precise, and to help you remember this recipe in the future. Another interesting note is that even though the liquid ingredients for short crust pastries vary, a good rule of thumb is they will generally be half the weight of the fat. So that's about 56 grams. Since there is no US measurement for that equivalent currently, we have modified the recipe slightly to make it easier for the beginner. So feel free to experiment with the water content as you gain some confidence. You can even try milk instead of water. See how these small adjustments change the texture and taste of the dough. It will come down to what you prefer in the end. As you work the flour and water in the dough, you will end up with a breadcrumb consistency, but it will be more like wet sand. This is exactly what you are after. When you squeeze the dough together with your hands, it should hold together easily yet crumble apart with pressure. This is perfect as it will give you a beautifully crisp and tender crust. Finally, we need to bring together the dough. Pour it out onto a clean work surface and make sure to scrape out those sides well. You can even use the dough itself to help you with this task. You do not want to leave any of that fat behind. This is essential for making a great pastry recipe. We want to now begin the pickup stage. It's called the pickup stage, or picking up, because you are picking up the pieces that didn't fully come together while you were mixing it. We will be using our hands and the pastry dough to pick up any crumbs that haven't yet been incorporated. You do not want to knead this dough just like the other short crust pastries, but rather you want to gently squeeze and fold the crumbs into one cohesive unit. Take your time here and go slow. Kneading the dough will only create gluten, and you want to be as gentle as possible to avoid that. This is our final of the 4 types of short crust pastry. It is perfect for desserts, but be mindful of that sugar content so you don't overwhelm your fillings. This is a great dough to balance out tart recipes like raspberries or dark chocolate. After all the dough is combined, you now want to shape this into a disc. Of course, if you're making something square, shape it into a square. Or a rectangle, use a rectangle. Common sense. Anyway, we're going to use a disc because we're going to make pie shells. So we're going to pat this dough into a disc no taller than 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. Now, if you have room in your fridge, go ahead and pat it out even shorter so it'll be even easier to roll out when you are ready to bake those pies and pastry. You want to wrap it up well and then let it sit in the fridge for a good 2 hours. Overnight is even better as it will really develop those flavors and give a better texture. This is my favorite pastry to work with. It's just so delicate, tender, and easy to maneuver. Now it will be more prone to tearing, especially when you go to transfer it, but I don't mind it as I love this dough. I think you will too. It's so sweet, it's nearly a dessert on its own. And in fact, I often make them into cookies just to enjoy. You may find yourself wanting to just eat the pie shell and not even worry about the filling. Congratulations, we are finally finished with our short crust pastry recipes. Wasn't that fun? Soon we will learn how to roll out the dough, create some easy borders, and how to blind bake your crust. You will be known as having a crispy, buttery, and flaky delight as opposed to soggy pie shells. Isn't that something to look forward to? I hope you enjoyed this recipe. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy baking.